Kemi sat in the heart of her grand living room, surrounded by family members and close friends who had come to mourn with her. Her eyes were swollen and red from endless weeping. Her husband, Benga, the man she had loved and devoted herself to for 25 years, was gone. They had met when she was only 20, full of dreams and naive optimism, while he, at 32, had been a charismatic, confident businessman who had swept her off her feet. He had been her first and only love, the man who had taught her what it meant to trust completely. Together they had built a beautiful life. They had raised 2 wonderful children, Jide, now 24, and Dami, 23, who had grown into strong, responsible young adults. Through the highs and lows of life, she had never doubted his love, nor had she questioned his unwavering devotion. One evening, after most of the mourners had left, Kemi sat in the living room, exhausted. Then the door opened and Mr. John, one of Benga's business associates, walked in. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a young woman, probably in her late 20s, with a sharp, determined look on her face. Holding her hand was a little girl about 5 years old, staring curiously around the room. "Kemi," Mr. John said. "We need to talk." Kemi frowned. "About what?" He gestured toward the woman. "This is Susan. And this child is Benga's daughter." Susan was Benga's mistress. Kemi shook her head. "No, that's not true." Susan scoffed. "Oh, it's true. Benga and I were together for years, and this is his daughter. He took care of us. But now that he's gone, my daughter deserves her share of her birthright." Kemi's face hardened. "Benga was a good man. He would never cheat on me." "You're lying." Susan's eyes flashed with anger. "Believe whatever you want. But I have proof." She pulled out some papers from her bag and tossed them on the table. Kemi didn't even look at them. "Get out of my house," Kemi said coldly. Susan folded her arms. "I'm not leaving until we settle this." "There's nothing to settle," Kemi snapped. "If you think you and your child are entitled to anything, then you can wait for the will to be read. Until then, I don't want to see you here again." Susan glared at her, then turned to Mr. John. "Fine. I'll wait," she said. "But don't think I'll walk away empty-handed." She grabbed her daughter's hand and stormed out. How could this be possible? Benga had never given her the slightest reason to doubt him. As she struggled to come to terms with this devastating revelation, fate delivered yet another cruel blow. A few days later, in an effort to make sense of her husband's business affairs, Kemi began sifting through his office files. She had always trusted Benga to handle their finances, never questioning where their wealth had come from. But as she scanned through the documents, page after page revealed the dark truth. Benga had been deeply entangled in corruption. He had built his empire not on integrity and hard work as she had believed, but on deceit, fraud, and underhanded deals. Kemi felt devastated. Her upbringing had instilled in her the value of honesty. If she reported Benga's crimes, their entire fortune would be seized, and their family name would be dragged through the mud. Her children, Jide and Dami, who had done nothing wrong, would be left with nothing. But if she remained silent, she would be complicit in his corruption. As Kemi wrestled with this impossible decision, she found herself confiding more in her best friend, Uche. Uche had been her rock throughout the mourning period, offering her comfort in a way no one else could. But Uche was different from Kemi, bold, unconventional, and unbothered by societal expectations. She had never been married, had 2 daughters from different relationships, and had always encouraged Kemi to loosen up, to put herself first for once. One evening, Uche poured them both a glass of wine. "Kemi," she said, "for years, you've done everything right. You've been the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect woman. But what has it brought you? A husband who lied to you. A life built on illusions. Maybe it's time to stop living for everyone else and start living for yourself." Kemi sighed, staring at her wine glass. "Uche, I need you to be there tomorrow when the will is read." Uche frowned. "Why?" Kemi nodded slowly. "I don't trust myself. If it's confirmed that Benga is truly the father of that girl, I might lose my mind." Uche placed a hand on hers. "I'll be there." The next day arrived. The lawyer's office was silent. Kemi sat stiffly with Jide and Dami. Uche sat beside them. Across from them, Susan sat with her daughter, looking confident. Mr. John was also there. The lawyer cleared his throat and started reading. To my beloved wife, Kemi, I owe you an apology. I was not the faithful man you believed me to be. I had an affair with Susan, and for that I am deeply sorry. The lawyer continued. I agreed with Susan when she said she was pregnant with my child because I wanted to keep seeing her. But the truth is, I knew all along that the child was not mine. 10 years ago, after my accident, the doctors told me I could never make a woman pregnant again. The injury destroyed that part of me, though my manhood still functioned normally. Susan's mouth fell open. No. That's not possible, she whispered. The lawyer didn't stop. I never told you, Kemi, because I was ashamed. I thought you would see me as less of a man. I should have been honest with you, and for that I ask for your forgiveness. In my will, I leave nothing to Susan or her daughter, as I am not the father. Susan's face burned red. She turned to Mr. John. Say something, she hissed. Mr. John shook his head. Susan, it's over. Susan gritted her teeth, then grabbed her daughter's hand and stood. Let's go, she muttered, storming out. The door slammed behind her. Even though it was a bit of a relief, Kemi still felt betrayed. Benga had lied to her for years. About Susan, about the child, about his business, and even about himself. He had carried a secret that changed everything, and now he was gone, leaving her to deal with the mess alone. Then one morning, as she sat in Benga's office, surrounded by the weight of his secrets, she made a decision. She would take over his business, not as a grieving widow, but as a woman who had learned the hard way that life was not black and white. If corruption was the price of survival, then so be it. She was done being the woman who followed the rules only to be left with nothing. With newfound determination, she picked up her phone and called Uche. Uche, she said. I'm done playing by the rules. It's my turn to live. Uche's delighted laughter rang through the line. Now that's what I like to hear. We're celebrating tonight. Just you and me. That evening they went to a Lagos nightclub. Kemi felt something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. No more worrying about society's expectations. No more mourning a man who had deceived her. Tonight was about her. A charming young man named David approached her, flashing a confident smile. You're the most beautiful woman here, he said as his eyes locked on hers. For the first time in decades, Kemi felt alive. And as she allowed herself to smile back, she knew her future was hers to define. By the time the night drew to a close, David whispered to her, saying, Let's go somewhere private. Kemi nodded. They spent the night in a luxurious hotel room, wrapped in passion, leaving behind the burdens of their pasts. And for the first time since Benga's death, Kemi felt truly alive. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of the hotel bed. As Kemi adjusted the silk robe around her shoulders, David reached for his phone. Give me your number, he said, his voice smooth, expectant. But Kemi simply smiled, shaking her head. It was just for fun, she said softly. No need to see each other again. She stood, gathered her things, and walked out of the room, leaving David as nothing more than a memory. Or so she thought. A year had passed and life had settled into its usual rhythm. Kemi had taken over Benga's business empire. But despite her newfound authority, a part of her still longed for something she couldn't quite name. Then one afternoon her phone rang. It was her daughter, Dami, calling from Abuja. Mom. Dami's voice was filled with excitement. I have the most amazing news. I've been seeing someone for 6 months and we're talking about marriage. Kemi's heart swelled with joy. That's wonderful, my love. I can't wait to meet him. 2 weeks later, Dami was to visit her mom in Lagos with her fiancé. Kemi stood at the arrival gate of Lagos Airport as she scanned the crowd for her daughter. Excitement bubbled in her chest as she saw Dami. Walking beside Dami hand in hand was David. The same David. Her David. Their eyes met, and in that brief, electric moment, shock and horror flickered across both of their faces. But they were not alone. Dami, oblivious to the romantic history between her fiancé and her mother, was excited to introduce them. Mom, she said, throwing her arms around Kemi. This is David. David, this is my mother, Mrs. Kemi. David extended his hand. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Kemi, he said. Kemi forced a smile, concealing her true emotions. But inside, panic clawed at her. How could this be happening? The man her daughter loved was the same man she had shared a secret, passionate night with. As the days unfolded, Kemi and David never mentioned their past, never allowed even the subtlest hint of recognition to pass between them. But the tension was thick whenever they were in the same room. 6 months later, Dami and David had a grand wedding. The air was thick with celebration, the scent of fresh flowers filling the air as music and laughter surrounded them. To the world it was a perfect wedding. 10 months after the wedding, Dami gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. Kemi traveled to Abuja to help her daughter adjust to motherhood, and while she cherished the time with her grandchild, every encounter with David was a silent reminder of the past they had buried. One afternoon while Dami stayed home with the baby, she needed some home supplies. David offered to drive Kemi into town for some errands. The car ride was quiet at first. Then suddenly Kemi broke the silence. "David," she said softly, "we've never talked about that night." "I know," he murmured. "We kept it hidden for Dami's sake. I think we handled it the right way." Kemi nodded. "Yes, we did. But it's been difficult pretending it never happened." David turned to her. "I've thought about that night a lot," he confessed. "I enjoyed it, Kemi. I didn't forget." Then without a word, David turned the car sharply, pulling into a hotel parking lot. "Why are we stopping here?" Kemi whispered with a shaky voice. "I'm getting a room," he said. "I'll send you the room number. If you don't come in 30 minutes, I'll come back to the car, apologize, and we'll never talk about this again." Kemi stared at him. "This is crazy, David. You need to turn the car around right now." But David didn't budge. "You want me, Kemi?" "I know you do." His voice was quiet but firm. "I'll wait for you." With that he stepped out of the car and disappeared into the hotel. Kemi sat frozen, her heart pounding, her mind spiraling. After a short while her phone beeped and she saw the message. Room 202. She tried to fight it, but after what felt like hours of struggling with herself, she finally gave in. She stepped out of the car, entered the hotel and found room 202. A single knock. The door opened. And the past repeated itself. They spent 4 hours in that room before returning to the car to finish their errands. Kemi barely spoke as they finished their errands. The reality of what she had done, again, pressed down on her. The next morning, unable to bear the suffocating guilt any longer, she packed her bags and told Dami she needed to return to Lagos for an urgent matter. Dami tried to convince her to stay, but Kemi insisted on leaving for Lagos immediately. 4 months passed. Kemi threw herself into work, trying to drown her guilt in endless business meetings and social gatherings. Then one morning as she was jogging with her friend, Uche, along the quiet streets of their gated estate, Kemi suddenly collapsed. She was rushed to the hospital where doctors revived her and ran some tests. The doctor soon entered her room with surprising news. "Congratulations, Mrs. Kemi, you are 4 months pregnant." Silence filled the room. "No," Kemi whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible." Panic surged through her like a tidal wave. "I can't have this baby," she said, her voice trembling. "Doctor, I want to terminate the pregnancy." The doctor sighed. "Mrs. Kemi, at your age, this pregnancy is high risk. Termination would be even more dangerous. I strongly advise against it." Tears spilled down her cheeks. This couldn't be happening. 4 days she stayed locked in her home, refusing visitors and drowning in grief and despair. But no matter how much she tried to deny it, reality remained unchanged. She was carrying David's child. In the end, Kemi couldn't keep the secret any longer. One evening she called Dami. "Mom." Dami answered cheerfully. "It's been so long. Are you okay?" Kemi's voice was hollow. "Dami, we need to talk." That night, Kemi told her daughter everything. About her affair with David, about the night in the hotel, and about the pregnancy that now threatened to unravel everything. Dami was heartbroken. "Mom, you should have told me from the start. If I had known, I would never have married David. I could have found another man to love. Now look at this mess." Kemi sobbed. "I didn't know how. I was ashamed. I didn't want to hurt you." 4 days, Dami and David fought and their marriage was shaken to its core. Then one day, Dami visited her mother Kemi, in Lagos with an impossible request. "Mom," Dami's voice was soft, almost fragile. "You know, I almost died giving birth to my son. The doctors told me I can never have another child." She looked away, swallowing hard. "But you can. Please, give birth to this baby and let me raise it as my own second child." Kemi's world spun. She had never expected this. Could she really go through with it? 4 days she wrestled with the decision, but in the end she agreed. When the time came, Kemi gave birth to a healthy baby girl, a child that belonged to both her and David, yet would never truly be hers. Dami and David remained married. Together they raised 2 children. To the world they were a happy family. To Kemi they were a painful reminder of choices that could never be undone. She visited often, playing the role of grandmother while knowing the truth could never be spoken. The past was buried, but the weight of secrecy never faded. Kemi and David kept their distance, speaking only when necessary, their interactions void of the emotions that had once burned so brightly between them. The lesson from Kemi's story is a harsh but necessary one. Betrayal leaves scars that never fully heal. Secrets, once planted, take root and grow, entangling everything in their path. When people allow desire to cloud their judgment, when they prioritize the present without considering the future, the consequences can be devastating. Some lines once crossed can never be redrawn.